As a reporter covering the phenomenon of Jonathan Antoine, it is impossible to forget the moment he stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in 2012, a shy 17-year-old who looked more like someone bracing for ridicule than a future star, only to unleash a voice so powerful that it shattered prejudice in an instant and earned him comparisons to Pavarotti. The headlines at the time were euphoric, describing him as a natural prodigy, yet the story behind those lights was far more complicated. 4 years Jonathan had been living in the shadows of bullying, depression, and self-doubt, experiences that continued to shape him even as the world celebrated his talent. In this in-depth report, we revisit the life of Jonathan Antoine, not through the glossy lens of viral videos, but through the quieter truths he has shared over time, revealing a journey marked by pain, resilience, and redemption. Jonathan Antoine's childhood in Essex, England, was far from the fairy tale that audiences might imagine for a future star, and as school records, interviews, and recollections from those who knew him reveal, it was a period defined by cruelty and isolation. From an early age, Jonathan was different, heavier than many of his peers, shy in demeanor, and deeply introspective, qualities that made him a frequent target of relentless bullying. Former classmates recounted how he was taunted with cruel nicknames, mocked in hallways, and excluded from social circles, with laughter often erupting at his expense. Teachers later admitted they saw the pain etched into his face but often felt powerless to intervene, and Jonathan himself, in candid interviews, recalled returning home in tears, believing he was worthless. Psychologists note that bullying of this severity leaves scars that last a lifetime, manifesting as anxiety, depression, and self-doubt, traits that would shadow Jonathan long after he left school. Yet even amid the cruelty, there was one constant refuge: music. Neighbors remembered hearing his voice drifting from his bedroom window, soaring above the taunts he endured during the day, and his parents encouraged him to nurture this gift, though they worried about the toll bullying was taking on his fragile confidence. In retrospect, this early adversity forged the raw emotion that would later pour from Jonathan's performances. Each note carried not only technical precision but also the weight of a boy who had learned to channel suffering into sound. From a reporter's perspective, this childhood chapter is essential to understanding Jonathan Antoine's rise. It was not simply the emergence of a prodigious voice, but the survival of a sensitive soul who found in music the only escape from a world that often seemed determined to silence him. As further details about Jonathan Antoine's adolescence emerge, it becomes clear that bullying was not just a fleeting cruelty but a relentless campaign that carved deep psychological wounds, shaping his perception of himself well into adulthood. Reporters who spoke to teachers and classmates from his school years confirmed a pattern of humiliation that was both consistent and cruel. Jonathan was mocked for his size, laughed at for his awkwardness, and ridiculed simply for daring to be different. What made it worse, according to those close to him, was that these attacks often came not in isolated moments but as a daily barrage, leaving him with little reprieve from the fear of ridicule. Psychologists reviewing his story later explained that such chronic bullying does more than cause temporary sadness. It rewires the way young people see themselves, embedding a sense of unworthiness and anxiety that can persist long after the bullying ends. Jonathan himself admitted in early interviews that he often felt invisible or wished to disappear altogether, describing nights where he lay awake convinced he had no place in the world. These confessions aligned with the testimonies of friends who remembered how Jonathan withdrew socially, preferring solitude over the risk of another painful encounter. Yet amid this turmoil, there was one contradiction that reporters found striking. The very thing that exposed Jonathan to ridicule, his unusual intensity and passion, was also the seed of his gift. He spent hours alone, rehearsing arias, exploring music that his peers neither understood nor appreciated, and in those moments he transformed his anguish into art. Still, the toll on his mental health was undeniable. Depression loomed over him, anxiety gnawed at him, and he often doubted whether he would ever find a way out. From a reporter's standpoint, Jonathan's teenage years illustrate the destructive cycle of bullying, how it erodes confidence and feeds isolation, but also how, in rare cases like his, it can inadvertently forge resilience. By the time Jonathan walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2012, he was not just a singer auditioning for a competition. He was a survivor carrying years of scars, a boy whose voice had become both shield and salvation against the relentless cruelty of his formative years. The pivotal moment that redefined Jonathan Antoine's life came in 2012 when he stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent with his school friend and duet partner Charlotte Jaconelli, and as journalists covering the series remember, the atmosphere in the theater that night was charged with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Here was a nervous, overweight 17-year-old shuffling toward the microphone, his eyes darting with unease, his body language betraying the years of bullying that had conditioned him to expect ridicule rather than acceptance. Simon Cowell, notorious for his blunt assessments, looked unconvinced, and the audience braced for another forgettable act. But what followed became one of the most dramatic turnarounds in the show's history. As soon as Jonathan opened his mouth to sing The Prayer, the auditorium fell into stunned silence, then erupted with applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the walls. Cowell, who moments earlier had raised an eyebrow in doubt, was suddenly leaning forward in astonishment, declaring that Jonathan's voice was a natural gift on par with Luciano Pavarotti. Amanda Holden admitted to Goosebumps, while newspapers across Britain the following morning plastered his face and voice across their front pages, hailing him as the discovery of the season. Yet for Jonathan, reporters later revealed, the experience was bittersweet. Backstage he trembled, overwhelmed by the reaction, scarcely able to reconcile the love pouring from strangers with the years of contempt he had endured from peers. Britain's Got Talent had given him not just a platform but also a mirror, showing him a version of himself that he had never dared believe existed. A future star instead of a bullied boy. The performance went viral online, accumulating millions of views within days, and Jonathan Antoine's name became synonymous with defying expectations. From a reporter's perspective, this was more than a breakthrough audition. It was a cultural moment that exposed the danger of snap judgments and reminded the public that brilliance often hides behind appearances. For Jonathan, it was the night he traded invisibility for recognition, but also the night that set in motion the immense pressures and scrutiny that would follow him for the rest of his career. In the aftermath of his Britain's Got Talent debut, Jonathan Antoine was thrust into a level of fame few teenagers could comprehend, and as reporters documented at the time, the same moment that brought him adoration also exposed him to an unforgiving media spotlight that magnified his vulnerabilities. Overnight, Jonathan's name dominated headlines, his performance replayed across global news outlets, and his story spun into a modern-day fairy tale of the bullied boy turned prodigy. Yet behind the applause was a darker current. Tabloids that praised his voice often undercut their compliments by fixating on his appearance, publishing unflattering photographs alongside headlines that reinforced the very insecurities Jonathan had battled since childhood. Social media intensified this duality. While thousands of fans posted messages of awe and support, others mocked his size or questioned whether someone who looked like him could truly sustain a career in classical music. For Jonathan, still only 17, the pressure was immense. Insiders revealed that he often retreated after interviews, visibly shaken, struggling to reconcile the world's sudden embrace with the internalized voices of years of bullying. Even as Simon Cowell's record label signed Jonathan and Charlotte to a lucrative contract, journalists noted Jonathan's discomfort with the relentless branding that followed, particularly the moniker, the new Pavarotti, which, while flattering, carried enormous expectations. Psychologists later explained that such meteoric fame can create emotional whiplash, especially for someone with fragile self-esteem. The shift from invisibility to global scrutiny leaves little time to adjust, and the constant magnification of both strengths and flaws can deepen existing anxieties. Jonathan admitted in later interviews that while Britain's Got Talent saved him from despair, it also introduced a new kind of pressure, one that often felt suffocating. From a reporter's standpoint, this chapter in his story highlights the paradox of sudden fame. The same spotlight that illuminated his extraordinary talent also exposed his deepest insecurities, forcing him to navigate a world where every note he sang was celebrated but every image of his body was dissected. It was a crucible that would test not only his artistry but also his resilience, shaping the path of his career and the battles he would continue to fight long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even as Jonathan Antoine's star rose in the years following his Britain's Got Talent breakthrough, reporters who observed him closely noted that the applause masking his performances could not fully drown out the emotional scars he carried within, scars that had been etched long before he ever stepped into the spotlight. While the public marveled at his voice and critics compared him to the greatest tenors of history, Jonathan himself often described a disconnect between what the world celebrated and what he felt inside. In candid interviews, he admitted to experiencing moments of emptiness even after standing ovations, confessing that he sometimes questioned whether audiences truly valued him as a person or simply as a voice. Friends and colleagues recalled how Jonathan, backstage after dazzling performances, would sometimes sit quietly in contemplation, his joy subdued by lingering insecurities rooted in years of bullying and ridicule. Mental health experts consulted in media analyses explained that such internal conflicts are common among those who have suffered chronic bullying, where public affirmation struggles to counteract years of negative conditioning. Jonathan revealed that he continued to suffer panic attacks, sleepless nights, and periods of withdrawal, symptoms of anxiety and depression that fame had not erased but instead exacerbated under new pressures. He often isolated himself, preferring solitude over the overwhelming demands of media appearances and social expectations. The irony, as journalists pointed out, was that while his voice conveyed raw emotion and authenticity that audiences found profoundly moving, those very emotions were drawn from a reservoir of pain that Jonathan struggled to manage in private. Critics wrote of how his performances carried a unique weight, as though every note bore traces of suffering transformed into beauty, yet the cost of that transformation was rarely acknowledged. From a reporter's perspective, this contrast between Jonathan's public triumphs and private turmoil underscores the complexity of his narrative. The bullied boy had become a global sensation, but the emotional scars of his past remained unhealed, shaping his artistry while simultaneously threatening his well-being. His story in this period was not just one of success but of survival, a delicate balance between brilliance on stage and fragility off it, reminding audiences that even the most extraordinary talents remain profoundly human beneath the lights. One of the most defining aspects of Jonathan Antoine's early career was his partnership with Charlotte Jaconelli, a classmate whose bright soprano complemented his powerful tenor, and together they formed a duo that charmed Britain's Got Talent audiences and won a record deal immediately after the competition. Reporters at the time described their chemistry as effortless, with Charlotte's extroverted energy balancing Jonathan's shyness and providing him with visible reassurance during interviews and live appearances. Their first album, released under Simon Cowell's label, debuted in the top 5 of the UK charts, and their second release further cemented their reputation as rising stars in the classical crossover genre. Fans adored them not only for their harmonies but also for their genuine friendship, often referring to them as Jonathan and Charlotte, as though they were inseparable. Yet behind the scenes, industry insiders and journalists noted growing questions about their long-term future as a duo. In 2014, just 2 years after their meteoric rise, the pair announced an amicable split to pursue solo careers, a decision that surprised and saddened many fans. Publicly, both insisted that the separation was mutual and motivated by artistic growth, with Jonathan explaining that while he loved performing with Charlotte, they each had individual dreams to follow. Charlotte echoed the sentiment, adding that their bond as friends remained intact. However, reporters following Jonathan closely detected the emotional toll the split had on him. Having relied so heavily on Charlotte's presence as a shield against the harsh glare of fame, Jonathan suddenly found himself without that anchor, forced to face the pressures of the industry alone. He later admitted in interviews that he missed her companionship and that adjusting to life as a solo artist was daunting. Fans, too, expressed their heartbreak, flooding social media with laments about the end of a partnership they had cherished. From a journalist's perspective, the split marked a pivotal turning point. It was the moment Jonathan transitioned from being part of a duo to shouldering the identity of a solo artist, a shift that required not just artistic independence but also personal resilience. While the decision broadened his horizons, it also reopened vulnerabilities, removing the protective presence of Charlotte and exposing him to the industry's full weight. For Jonathan, the bond with Charlotte remained a treasured memory, but the split underscored a painful truth. He could no longer lean on another to soften the blows of fame. He had to stand on his own. When Jonathan Antoine embarked on his solo career in 2014, reporters and critics alike recognized both the immense opportunity before him and the daunting challenges that came with stepping out from the shadow of a beloved duo. Signing with Sony Classical, he released his debut album Tenor, which immediately topped the UK classical charts and drew widespread acclaim for its blend of traditional arias and fresh interpretations of modern pieces. Critics hailed his renditions of Nessun Dorma and How Great Thou Art as proof that his voice was not only powerful but also maturing with remarkable depth. Yet behind the glowing reviews, Jonathan faced the lonely reality of being a solo performer. Without Charlotte Jaconelli by his side, the responsibility of carrying interviews, tours, and the emotional weight of fame fell squarely on his shoulders. Journalists who spent time with him during this period described a man both proud of his accomplishments and quietly burdened by self-doubt. He often downplayed his achievements, apologizing for minor mistakes, and confessed in interviews that he struggled to believe in his own worth, even as audiences stood in ovation. Touring schedules added to the strain, demanding not only vocal stamina but also emotional resilience, and those close to him admitted that Jonathan often retreated into solitude after performances, overwhelmed by the social demands of his profession. The release of his second solo album Believe in 2016 reinforced his status as a serious artist, with standout tracks like Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, demonstrating a raw emotional honesty that captivated listeners. However, even as his artistry deepened, the pressure intensified. He was no longer part of a promising duo but a singular talent expected to live up to the moniker, the new Pavarotti, a comparison that weighed heavily on him. Reporters observed that Jonathan's career during this phase was a paradox. Outwardly, a series of triumphs marked by chart-topping albums and critical praise. Inwardly, a test of endurance for a young man still grappling with the insecurities of his past. From a journalistic perspective, Jonathan's solo career illustrates the complexity of artistic independence, proving that while talent can shine alone, the emotional toll of carrying success without a partner can be immense. His journey as a soloist was not just about establishing credibility in the music industry, but about confronting his own fears, learning to trust his voice in every sense, and navigating the fragile line between brilliance on stage and vulnerability off it. As Jonathan Antoine's solo career advanced, another narrative emerged that reporters could not ignore. His candid acknowledgement of an ongoing battle with depression, a struggle that often ran parallel to his professional success and shaped the very fabric of his artistry. While his albums climbed the charts and his voice filled concert halls, Jonathan confessed in interviews that there were mornings when he felt unable to rise from bed, weighed down by a sense of emptiness that applause could not cure. He described moments of panic before stepping onto stage, where the expectation to perform flawlessly collided with a deep internal fragility. Those close to him recounted periods of withdrawal, when Jonathan would isolate himself from friends and colleagues, conserving energy not only for his voice but also for the mental effort required to maintain appearances. Mental health experts consulted by journalists emphasized that his trajectory was a textbook case of how fame and early trauma can intertwine, creating emotional whiplash. The bullied boy suddenly transformed into a celebrated tenor, yet the scars of ridicule and years of self-doubt did not vanish, instead amplified under public scrutiny. Jonathan's honesty about these struggles marked a turning point, both for his personal narrative and for public discourse. By admitting openly that he battled depression, he dismantled the illusion that fame equated to happiness and offered fans a rare glimpse of vulnerability from someone in the public eye. The response was immediate and powerful. Thousands of supporters flooded social media with words of encouragement, many sharing their own stories of depression and thanking Jonathan for giving them courage. Reporters covering these developments noted that Jonathan had inadvertently become an advocate for mental health, using his platform not through speeches or campaigns but through the raw authenticity of his admissions. Yet even with this outpouring of support, the fight remained arduous. Jonathan acknowledged that recovery was not linear, that dark days persisted, but he also spoke of therapy, family support, and the grounding effect of music as tools that helped him navigate the storm. From a journalist's standpoint, Jonathan's confrontation with depression is not a sidebar to his career but a defining chapter, one that adds depth to his artistry and humanity to his fame. His story reminds audiences that even voices capable of silencing a crowded theater may still tremble in private, and that acknowledging fragility is itself an act of profound strength. After years of battling insecurities and the heavy shadow of depression, Jonathan Antoine's return to the stage with a renewed sense of strength marked a turning point that reporters covering his career described as both a comeback and a rebirth. Gone was the boy who once trembled under the glare of cameras, leaning heavily on others for reassurance. In his place stood a man who had learned, through hardship and healing, to embrace both his talent and his flaws. Critics noted that while Jonathan's voice had always possessed extraordinary technical brilliance, his later performances carried something more elusive: emotional authenticity. When he sang, audiences no longer heard just the trained precision of a tenor but the lived experience of someone who had confronted pain and emerged stronger. Reviewers remarked that his renditions of classics such as Nessun Dorma or contemporary pieces like Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah were infused with raw emotion that seemed to transcend the music itself, transforming concerts into cathartic experiences for both singer and audience. Fans described being moved to tears not only by the power of his voice but also by the sense that Jonathan was sharing a piece of his soul with every note. Journalists who interviewed him during this period observed a striking change in demeanor. Jonathan spoke more openly about his struggles, no longer hiding behind vague answers, and acknowledged that while bad days still came, he had developed tools and support systems to cope with them. His candor resonated strongly in a cultural moment where discussions of mental health were gaining traction, making him not just a performer but also a voice of reassurance for others facing similar challenges. Industry insiders highlighted that his renewed presence on stage was not about reinventing himself but about reclaiming his narrative, showing that vulnerability could coexist with strength. From a reporter's perspective, Jonathan's return was emblematic of a broader truth: that true artistry often emerges not in spite of pain but because of it. By transforming his scars into song, Jonathan Antoine redefined himself not simply as a prodigious tenor but as a symbol of resilience, proving that even the most fragile beginnings can lead to extraordinary triumphs when one finds the courage to step back into the light. Looking back over more than a decade of Jonathan Antoine's journey, reporters are left with a narrative that transcends the boundaries of entertainment and becomes a mirror reflecting both the cruelty and compassion of the human condition. His story demonstrates that prodigious talent, no matter how breathtaking, does not shield an individual from pain, nor does applause necessarily translate into self-acceptance. Jonathan's early life, scarred by bullying and isolation, planted the seeds of insecurity that would haunt him even at the height of his fame, reminding us that trauma leaves long shadows. Yet it also forged in him a depth of emotion that elevated his performances beyond mere technical mastery, giving them the authenticity that critics and fans alike described as transformative. The lessons of his life extend far beyond music. First, his experiences reveal the dangerous consequences of judging people by appearances, as both his peers and the media often did, overlooking the person behind the image. Second, his candidness about depression and later his autism diagnosis underscore the importance of acknowledging vulnerability and dismantling the stigma around mental health and neurodiversity. By choosing to speak openly, Jonathan not only humanized his own struggles but also empowered countless fans who saw their reflections in his honesty. Third, his evolution from a nervous teenager to a confident soloist shows that resilience is not about never falling but about finding the strength to rise again, even when the weight of expectation feels unbearable. Finally, his commitment to authenticity, whether in his music, his personal health journey, or his openness with fans, demonstrates that true greatness lies not in perfection but in the courage to be genuine. From a reporter's perspective, Jonathan Antoine's legacy is therefore twofold. He is an artist of extraordinary ability whose voice will continue to inspire, and he is a man whose willingness to bear his struggles has redefined what it means to be a star in the modern era. His story compels us to listen not just to the sound of his music but to the silence between the notes, where resilience, pain, and humanity dwell. In the end, the lesson is clear. Jonathan Antoine is not only a tenor who defied expectations but also a testament to the power of vulnerability, reminding us all that even the most heartbreaking journeys can illuminate the path toward hope and strength.